In this presentation, I'm hoping to ignite your interest in the challenges presented by the global youth demographic and to think about the programs that we design in efforts at peace. I'll draw on my own research in sub-Saharan Africa to raise a number of important insights, which I raise in the spirit of conversation starters in relation to how we think about youth problems, youth programs, and peace. So first, turning to global demographics. As many of you may know, under 24s today represent half of the global population. This is the largest ever, substantively largest ever generation of young people. In the part of the world where I work, 43% are under the age of 14. And those trends extend to a number of other places around the globe, Afghanistan, Pakistan, for instance. We know from the political science literature that these large youth cohorts, sometimes called youth bulges, are associated with a number of forms of political violence and violent conflict. And we often hear youth referred to as a peril. But I pause to note that we usually hear a dichotomy. Youth are either a peril or a promise, a disaster or a dividend, troublemakers or peacemakers, depending on global, national, and local priorities. That is, on programs and policies that are meant to address youth. So I focus today on these programs and policies, and especially on education, by which I mean formal schooling, job skills training, which often is presented as an alternative. So if we turn for a moment just to easy to access sources, one can find global testament to the importance of education, job skills training, and youth in the global focus on peace. For instance, on the slide on the left, you can see a statement by President Obama to the UN in 2014, committing to expanding support to entrepreneurship, civil society, education, and youth, because, I quote him, ultimately, these investments are the best antidote to violence. I quote on the other side of this slide an op-ed from the New York Times with the headline, "Here's a woman fighting terrorism with microloans." It's my highlighting in the quote that points to the importance of job creation and educational opportunities. Here the claim is made for draining the swamps that breed terrorists. I often find this same logic in my own research, and so here point to some statements by the government of Kenya, which too highlights the importance of education and jobs, which are needed, in their words, to turn the reality of the youth menace into the greatest resource of this country. And they frequently make reference to formal schooling and informal jobs, skills, training programs as a strategy to prevent violence, and in their case, prevent recruitment by Al-Shabaab. I pause for a moment to note also the tragic events last Friday in Paris, and to say that if you listen carefully to the news, we're already beginning to see this same kind of logic reflected in preliminary responses. And you can already hear calls for youth programming in the banlieue that help undereducated youth or youth that are presumed not to have opportunities in such education and job skills training programs. So there is globally great faith in education, job skills training. And I too am a great believer in the power and the promise of education. But I think this story is more complicated when we think about it through peace and conflict lenses. Indeed, there are a host of studies that tell us that the results of schooling interventions, of skills training, of even employment on peace are much more mixed than we might hope. Part of the problem, I'll argue today, or at least ask you to consider, may be found in the dominant logic that underlies these programs, and that is the logic of opportunity costs, which is very much a materialist and technical take on the importance, the benefits of education, formal and informal. This dominant logic, too, can be found in all of the sources that I've already quoted. Here, I choose to draw on a couple of interviews that I conducted with non-governmental organizations in Kenya. And you can see, for instance, on the left, a statement by a woman talking to me about how a lot of young people who participated in violence are a vulnerable group. They don't have much education, which may then really limit opportunities for them and also make them take an attitude of having nothing to lose. On the right-hand side, I choose a quote that makes the same point in relation to jobs and job skills training. This person was talking about the post-election violence in 2007, 2008, and saying of youth who had been the predominant participants, she believed that I feel if they had jobs, they may not have engaged in such activities. She quotes, as nearly every interviewee did, that youth are idle. They don't have jobs, and they join once they're told, if you join, you'll be paid something small. So this opportunity cost logic is dominant not only in scholarship, but in the popular press and the field as well. So I ask, well, what is left out of this dominant logic? And I'd like to share with you just 3 points from my research that I've conducted over the last 10 years, first in Rwanda and more recently the last couple of years in Kenya. I conduct in-depth, typically qualitative research where I speak with students and youth, speak with teachers and school administrators, speak with people that organize and run youth programs and peace-building programs targeted at youth. And here are 3 things I'd like us to consider are left out of the dominant conversation. First, and obviously, youth voices, and I would add from my research, youth aspirations. I've spent the last couple of years talking to youth in Nairobi, youth that are both in schools and out of schools, about what it is they want and why they hope for those things. And I find that youth have high and many aspirations for, among other things, education and careers. I also find that despite all of the challenges they face, they're exceedingly optimistic. Now, I would underline part of the reason these youth have aspirations for education and for certain careers is materialist, in the sense of the opportunity cost logic. But I would argue that what we're leaving out in that focus is harnessing youth's hope and also thinking about the self-identity factors, these non-material factors that are so crucial to youth aspirations. Youth aspire to jobs, careers, education, also because they want respect. They want to make meaningful contributions to their communities. And I would encourage us to think about how these dominant explanations are leaving out hope and also the self-identity factors that matter to youth and that may contribute to program success. The second factor that I would argue is left out in the dominant focus are social structures. Focusing on providing education or providing job skills training is a supply-side focus. That means that we're pushing youth to solve youth problems, and we're putting the locus of responsibility squarely on the shoulders of youth. In conversations with youth, they identify a host of challenges that they face, including poverty, corruption, I'm drawing on my interviews in Kenya, so tribalism, generational conflict. And I would argue, too, that in the dominant focus, when we leave out a focus on these entrenched social structures that matter to youth, we're missing out on something that may well contribute to program success. The third oversight that I would argue from my research is to point to the complexities and the nuance. Here I draw on my earlier research in Rwanda, which Francesco kindly introduced. When we think about education and job skills training through the opportunity cost logic, we're treating these programs as black boxes. We're treating them, too, as panaceas. What I don't think we're doing is investigating the complexities and the nuances of how each of these processes and trainings transpire. In my book, I argue that because we focus so much on the hope and the potential of education to contribute to peace, we overlook the myriad ways in which education, by which I mean formal schooling, can actually contribute to underlying conflict. So in the book, in the case of Rwanda, I look how the structures of schooling, who has access to schools, how schools are set up, as well as the content of schooling, especially history curriculum and pedagogy, can, and I argue in the case of Rwanda have, a number of times over history, contributed to underlying conflict, that is, contributed to negative intergroup relations instead of the positive peace that we often hope and aspire for education and skills training. So with that, I'd like to very much thank you for your attention and hope that I've drawn your attention to youth. Most youth don't engage in violence. But for those that do, I hope we'll continue to ponder the fact that more of the same is unlikely to contribute to peace. And I hope to open a conversation about the role of youth in peace and conflict. Thanks so much for your attention.